I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
The state banquet was meant to be flawless, controlled, and dignified. But one flash of blue against Camilla's gown shattered the room's calm. Princess Anne saw it first. Her face changed before anyone understood why. Then, in front of guests, courtiers, and stunned family members, she halted the banquet after noticing Camilla wearing Diana's sapphire brooch, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any royal command. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne did not move at first. She simply stared, as if the entire room had narrowed into that one cruel point of blue. The state banquet, a formal royal dinner held to honor important guests and show the monarchy's strength, had been planned down to the last glance, the last toast, the last pause between words. Charles sat with the trained calm of a king who understood ceremony. Camilla held herself beside him with careful confidence. William watched the room with quiet discipline, while Catherine noticed every shift in his face before anyone else did. Then Anne saw the brooch properly, and something inside the evening broke. Diana's sapphire brooch was not treated inside the family as ordinary jewelry. It carried grief, it carried memory, it carried the kind of pain that no palace statement could soften. Camilla's hand rested near it for a moment, almost protective, but the gesture only made the silence sharper. Saw Anne's expression before he followed her gaze, and when his eyes found the sapphire, his jaw tightened. Catherine leaned slightly toward him, not speaking, but understanding at once that the wound had become visible. Anne placed her hand on the table. The sound was small, but it cut through the room like a command. She rose slowly, not in panic, not in confusion, but with the cold force of someone who had already made her decision. Camilla looked up at her, her face caught between pride and alarm. Charles turned first to his sister, then to his wife, and the king understood too late that this was not a misunderstanding that could be smiled away. Anne's voice stayed low, but every word reached the people who needed to hear it. This evening cannot continue under that insult. Camilla's fingers lifted instinctively to the sapphire. William lowered his gaze, but the gesture did not hide his pain. Catherine watched him carefully, and her own expression changed as she realized this was no longer a banquet problem. It was a family reckoning. Anne had not shouted. She had not performed outrage. She had simply stopped the machinery of royalty in front of everyone, forcing the room to face what it had tried for years to bury. Charles looked from Anne to Camilla, and the weight of the moment settled on him with brutal clarity. One brooch had done what no private meeting had dared to do. It had dragged Diana's memory back into the center of the monarchy and placed every unresolved loyalty under the lights. The guests waited, the courtiers froze, the family held its breath. But the true force of Anne's decision can only be understood by looking at the people trapped inside that room, and what each of them stood to lose. No one at that table saw the same brooch. Camilla saw authority. Anne saw betrayal. William saw his mother's memory pulled into a room that had never fully protected it. Catherine saw the future king struggling to remain silent. And Charles, caught between the woman beside him and the sister across from him, understood that this single jewel had forced every private pain into public view. Camilla turned slightly toward Charles, silently asking him to protect her from the judgment now rising across the table. The king did not answer quickly enough. That delay said more than any speech could have said. Anne remained standing, her posture hard and unbending, while the queen consort's confidence began to crack. The state banquet was meant to show unity before important guests, because these royal dinners are not only meals, they are public signals of power, order, and control. But now that control was gone, and everyone knew why. William stared down at the table, as if one wrong look might unleash years of grief. He could not openly challenge Camilla without turning the moment into a brutal family rupture, and yet silence felt like betrayal too. Catherine saw the struggle moving across his face. She placed her hand close to his sleeve, not grabbing him, not stopping him, just reminding him that he was not alone in the room. The princess knew what Diana's memory meant to him, and she knew that the sapphire had reached a place no protocol could protect. Anne looked at Camilla again, and her anger was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was controlled. For years, the Princess Royal had guarded the family's emotional boundaries, especially where duty, legacy, and Diana were concerned. A royal legacy means the memories, symbols, and responsibilities passed from one generation to the next, and Anne understood that some parts of that legacy could not be worn for effect. Camilla had arrived believing the brooch proved acceptance, but Anne saw something colder. She saw a line crossed in full view of the family. Charles shifted in his chair because he knew there had been a warning. Earlier that day, one senior aide had made clear in a written jewelry briefing that certain pieces connected to Diana should remain untouched for this event. The warning had been dismissed before the banquet began, treated as caution rather than command. Now a senior courtier watched Anne's face and understood the truth with chilling certainty. She was not improvising. She had been expecting this breach for months, and the brooch had simply confirmed what she already feared. Camilla's fingers hovered near the sapphire, then slowly dropped. The queen consort understood that the jewel no longer looked like honor. It looked like a claim. William finally lifted his eyes, and Charles saw the pain there before his son said a word. Catherine followed his gaze, Anne held her ground, and the room became a mirror, showing loyalties that had been hidden beneath smiles, seating plans, and polished speeches. Yet this confrontation did not begin with the banquet. It began with a private incident weeks earlier that turned suspicion into certainty. Weeks before the banquet, there had been another room, another jewel, and another silence. It happened during a private memorial preparation at Kensington, when Catherine opened a velvet tray meant for archival review and discovered Diana's sapphire brooch had been requested for Camilla's personal selection. That moment changed everything. Anne was told before sunset. William was told after dinner. And from that night forward, the banquet was no longer just a banquet. Catherine stood alone beside the tray, unable to touch what she had found. The Kensington Memorial Archive Review was meant to be a quiet family process, a private check of items linked to Diana before they were placed into a respectful memorial setting. An archive review simply means looking through important personal objects and deciding how they should be stored, protected, or shown. But this tray did not feel protective. It felt wrong. The sapphire brooch had been moved from memory into selection, and beside it sat a note that changed the air around her. Catherine read the words twice, approved for symbolic continuity. The phrase looked polished, careful, almost harmless, but its meaning cut deep. Symbolic continuity meant using an object from the past to suggest unity in the present, and the princess understood at once why that mattered. To the palace, the brooch could be presented as healing. To William, it could feel like his mother's pain being used to decorate someone else's acceptance. Catherine did not cry. She simply stepped back from the tray as if the sapphire itself had become too heavy to breathe near. Anne received the call before sunset, and her reaction was immediate. Catherine did not reveal it through gossip or vague palace whispers. She told the Princess Royal directly in a private phone conversation, repeating the wording from the note exactly as she had seen it. Anne listened without interrupting. Then she closed her diary with a sharp snap and said, "Then we will know exactly what they intended." Her anger was cold because she understood boundaries. Some rules were written in protocol, others lived in decency, and to her, this one should never have needed explaining. William learned after dinner, when Catherine told him in private, with no aides near them. The prince said almost nothing. That was what frightened her most. He did not rage, he did not demand names. He only looked away, and the silence told her that the pain had reached somewhere deeper than anger. Diana's memory was not a palace object to him. It was personal. It was unfinished. It was the quiet place inside him that duty had never managed to close. Anne made her promise that night. If the sapphire appeared at the banquet, she would not let the room pretend it was harmless. Catherine understood that promise. William felt its weight even without hearing every word. And when Camilla later entered the banquet wearing the brooch, Anne did not see a mistake. She saw the trigger fulfilled. The room waited for Charles to speak, but Anne moved first. She turned not toward the guests, not toward the aides, but directly toward Camilla. In that instant, the banquet became a reckoning. The queen consort touched the brooch as though it could defend her. Anne did not blink. William's face tightened. Catherine looked between them, and the monarchy's carefully protected silence finally cracked. Anne stepped closer to Camilla's side of the table, and the whole room seemed to shrink around them. The queen consort sat beside Charles, holding the place of the king's wife, a role meant to show stability, support, and royal unity. But Anne stood as something different. She stood as the family's blunt defender of lines that should never be crossed. A reigning consort means the spouse of the monarch who stands beside him in public duty. And Camilla had entered that role, believing the brooch showed acceptance. Anne saw it as something far more dangerous. Camilla lifted her chin, but her hurt showed before her words arrived. She told Anne she had worn the sapphire to honor the past, not to provoke pain. The queen consort's voice stayed careful, yet the carefulness made the wound sharper. Anne did not soften. She told Camilla that Diana's memory was not a costume of continuity, not a symbol to be borrowed when the palace wanted a smoother story. The words crossed the table like a judgment. William heard them and went still. Catherine saw his face tighten again, and she knew the sentence had touched the deepest part of him. Charles tried to stop the damage before it became permanent. The king reached for his glass, then stopped halfway, unable to hide his uncertainty. He told Anne this was not the place. She looked at him with a cold sadness that felt worse than anger. Leadership without protection, she warned him, becomes surrender. That sentence struck him hard, because it did not sound like rebellion. It sounded like truth. Charles had spent years trying to hold the family together, but Anne was making it clear that peace bought by silence was not peace at all. Anne then revealed what the room had not yet heard. The brooch had been flagged before the event in a private jewelry briefing, a written palace note used to approve or reject important royal pieces before major occasions. That meant Camilla's choice could not be brushed aside as innocent confusion. The warning existed. The concern had been known. Someone had ignored it. Camilla's fingers slowly left the sapphire, and the queen consort looked toward Charles again, but this time even he had no easy answer. William finally raised his head. Catherine watched him with quiet fear, because everyone understood that his next words could either contain the fracture or split the family open in front of the crown. Anne remained still. Camilla waited. Charles turned toward his son. But Anne's confrontation was only the visible strike. The real question was, who had allowed Camilla to wear the brooch in the first place? Inside the palace, jewels are never only jewels. They carry permission, rank, memory, and power. So when Diana's sapphire appeared on Camilla, Anne knew one thing immediately. Someone had opened a door that should have remained closed. Charles had the authority. Camilla had the desire. William had the wound. And Catherine, standing quietly beside him, understood that the battle was now about control over Diana's legacy. A courtier moved toward Charles with the approval note, and the room felt colder before the king even touched it. Royal jewels pass through careful layers of permission, because they are not treated like private accessories. They are symbols of family history, public rank, and royal approval. That was why this mattered. Camilla could not simply appear wearing Diana's sapphire by accident. Someone had cleared the path. Someone had decided the pain was worth the image. Anne watched the note reach Charles, and she knew the answer was now close enough to hurt. Charles read the note once. Then he set it down without speaking. The king held formal authority over palace permissions, meaning his office had the power to approve what could be worn at major royal events. But Anne believed authority meant more than signing off on appearances. To her, real leadership required emotional judgment, especially when William's grief was sitting at the same table as Camilla's ambition for acceptance. Charles looked torn, and that weakness became impossible to hide. He wanted to protect the queen consort from public shame, but he could also see the wound opening in his son. William stayed silent, and that silence became painful to watch. The prince was not weak. He was holding himself back, because one angry sentence from him could turn a royal crisis into a family collapse. Catherine understood that restraint. She knew he was protecting the institution from his own pain, even while that same institution had failed to protect Diana's memory. Camilla looked from William to Charles, searching for a sign that the king would defend her. But his face had changed, and she felt the protection she expected begin to slip. Anne reached for the approval note and read the phrase that mattered most: historic reconciliation. The words sounded smooth, but to her they were brutal. Historic reconciliation meant using a painful symbol from the past to suggest that old wounds had finally healed. Anne saw something different. She saw Diana's memory being used to force emotional closure on people who had never agreed to it. Camilla's eyes dropped toward the note, and for the first time that night, the queen consort seemed to understand that the brooch no longer belonged to her story. Charles looked at the paper again, and his expression darkened. The king knew the note had not protected anyone. It had exposed everyone. Anne watched him carefully, waiting to see whether he would choose comfort or truth. William remained still. Catherine stayed close. Camilla sat beside her husband, but the distance between them suddenly felt wider than the table itself. That silence from Charles became the first sign that the banquet halt had already begun to reshape the balance inside the room. The banquet did not resume. Plates remained untouched. Glasses stood full. The music died into a silence no one dared to challenge. Guests were guided away with careful smiles, but the damage was already moving faster than any aid could contain it. Camilla sat frozen, Anne stood unyielding, William looked wounded, and Charles faced the first visible proof that one decision over one brooch had shaken the entire evening apart. Aides began moving through the room with quiet urgency, guiding guests away under the careful phrase, "a private family matter." That phrase mattered because palace language is built to protect the crown, and the crown means the monarchy as an institution, not just the person wearing it. A state banquet is supposed to show control, unity, and royal discipline before powerful guests. When one stops suddenly, it does not feel like a pause. It feels like a crack in the whole machine. Anne understood that. Charles understood it too. Camilla felt it most painfully because the room had not just seen her challenged, it had seen her left uncertain. Camilla did not speak at first. The queen consort sat with her hand near the sapphire, exposed in a way no title could soften. Anne asked for the brooch to be removed before any formal proceedings continued. Formal proceedings are the official parts of royal events, the speeches, toasts, and ceremonial steps that keep the evening moving. But Anne made it clear there would be no moving forward while Diana's memory sat on Camilla's gown like a wound pretending to be honor. Charles refused at first. The king would not humiliate his wife in front of the room. He said it softly, but everyone heard the struggle behind it. William pushed back from the table and walked away before his pain became words he could not take back. Catherine followed him, not to control him, but to give him the quiet space he needed before duty pulled him back. The prince stood apart for a moment, breathing through anger that had waited years for a target. Catherine stayed close, and her silence steadied him more than any palace instruction could. When William returned, his voice was calm, but the calm made it devastating. He looked at Charles and said, "Diana deserved better than this." Charles lowered his eyes. That sentence weakened the refusal he had been holding on to. Camilla reached behind her shoulder with trembling fingers, struggling with the clasp. Catherine took one small step forward, then stopped, letting the moment remain the queen consorts alone. Anne watched without cruelty, but without regret. When the sapphire finally left the gown, the room shifted. Camilla had surrendered the brooch, but surrendering it did not end the pain. It confirmed the meaning of the fight. Anne exhaled for the first time all evening. Charles stared at the empty space where the jewel had been. William stood beside Catherine, wounded but steadier. Camilla held the brooch in her hand, as if it had become too heavy to own. Yet the most powerful moment came not in front of guests, but behind a closed door, where two voices finally spoke, without the palace between them. Away from the banquet hall, the shouting never came. That was what made the moment more devastating. William and Anne stood in a private room with no aides, no courtiers, and no polished phrases to protect them. For once, the monarchy's machinery fell silent. He did not speak as the future king. She did not speak as the Princess Royal. They spoke as two people still carrying Diana's absence. William stood near the door, one hand resting on the handle, unable to leave and unable to return. Anne placed the brooch box on a small table between them, and neither of them touched it at first. The Princess Royal, as the title traditionally given to the monarch's daughter, but in that room, the title mattered less than the woman who had just stopped an entire banquet to protect a memory. William looked at the box, as if the sapphire inside it had carried his mother back into a fight she should never have been forced to enter. Anne broke the silence first. She told him she had halted the evening because silence would have turned Diana's memory into palace property. That mattered, because royal symbols can quickly become public tools, used to send messages even when families are still grieving. William understood that danger better than anyone. He had lived for years with the difference between the world's Diana and his own mother. The public saw grace, tragedy, and legend. He remembered a voice, a hand, a laugh, and the pain of losing all of it too soon. William admitted the hardest part was not only seeing Camilla wear the brooch, it was watching the room wait to see whether he would object. The prince said the words quietly, but they landed heavily. He had felt every eye measuring him, testing whether grief would overpower duty. Anne listened without interrupting, and her face softened for the first time that night. She told him, "Grief does not become smaller because a man becomes king in waiting. A future king may inherit the throne, but he does not stop being a son." Anne then revealed, through that private conversation, what she had carried since the Kensington Memorial Archive review. She had prepared for this moment from the day Catherine told her the sapphire had been moved onto Camilla's selection tray. She had promised herself that if the brooch appeared at the banquet, she would act. William looked at her then with a new understanding. Anne had done what he could not do publicly, without making the monarchy look broken beyond repair. William finally stepped toward the table and closed the lid of the brooch box slowly. The sound was soft, but it felt final. Anne watched him, and he understood that this was no longer only about anger. It was about protection. Together, they agreed Diana's personal pieces needed a stricter family boundary, one that no approval note or polished phrase could cross again. By morning, however, the palace could no longer keep the night contained, because the world had already begun to react. By sunrise, the banquet was no longer a palace secret. One image defined the morning. Camilla seated in silence, the sapphire brooch gone, while Anne stood nearby with a face carved from judgment. The public did not need the full conversation to understand the wound. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd gathered quietly, some holding Diana photographs, while every headline asked the same question in different words. Who has the right to wear memory? Camilla sat alone as the broadcaster repeated Anne's banquet halt in measured, stunned tones. The queen consort reached for the remote and turned off the television, but the silence that followed felt worse than the coverage. A palace statement had already been released, calling the early ending a private family intervention. A palace statement is an official message from royal offices, written to control public understanding of a crisis. But this one did not calm anything. It only made people listen more closely, because everyone knew royal language becomes most careful when the truth is most dangerous. Charles unfolded the newspapers and saw the damage in black ink. One front page carried the headline, "The Sapphire That Silenced the Crown," with a cropped image of Camilla's empty shoulder after the brooch had been removed. The king folded the paper once, slowly, then placed it beside the approval note from the night before. He understood the trap now. If he defended Camilla without acknowledging Diana, he would look cold. If he honored Diana without protecting his wife, he would look weak. Either way, the brooch had forced him into a reckoning he had avoided for too long. Anne watched the reaction with no triumph. The princess had halted the banquet because she believed silence would have turned memory into property. But she also knew the public grief around Diana had never vanished. Outside Buckingham Palace, people gathered near the gates with blue flowers and old photographs, and the quiet crowd became its own statement. Broadcasters framed the story as a rare royal rupture, involving Diana's legacy, Camilla's position, and Anne's authority. A royal rupture means a visible break in the family's usual public unity, and this one cut deeper because it touched love, loss, and forgiveness. Camilla heard the public reading the brooch as provocation, and it shook her more than Anne's words had. The queen consort had believed the sapphire might show acceptance, but the country saw something else. They saw Diana's memory being worn before her sons had truly healed. Charles knew the palace could not dismiss that feeling as noise. William's silence had spoken. Anne's action had confirmed it. Catherine's steady presence had made the pain impossible to ignore. The monarchy now faced a choice sharper than any headline. It could manage the scandal with careful words, or it could accept the lesson hidden inside the damage. By morning, one truth had become impossible to bury. Diana's personal legacy needed protection, not presentation. And that meant Charles would have to make a final decision no one in the palace could avoid. In the end, the brooch did not destroy the monarchy. It exposed what the monarchy could no longer ignore. Diana's memory was not an ornament to be reassigned, not a symbol to be softened, and not a wound others could close on behalf of her sons. Anne's halt was shocking, but it was also clear. She drew a line where silence had failed, and everyone inside the palace felt it. Charles made the decision before the palace could hide behind another careful phrase. The sapphire brooch was returned to its box, and the king watched as it was placed inside the protected archive. A protected archive means a secure royal collection where sensitive personal items are stored and controlled, not simply brought out for public display. This mattered because Diana's most emotional pieces were no longer being treated as decoration. They were being treated as memory, and memory demanded permission from those who still carried the loss. Charles signed the new restriction order without ceremony. A restriction order is a written command that limits how something can be used, and this one removed Diana's most sensitive personal pieces from public rotation unless William and Harry's family line gave approval through a protected family process. The palace framed it as respect for personal legacy, but everyone inside those walls knew the truth. Anne had forced the change. Her stand at the banquet had turned a private warning into a royal boundary no one could ignore again. Camilla accepted the decision quietly. The queen consort did not fight the order, and that silence showed how deeply the night had marked her. She had been wounded by the humiliation, but she also understood that wearing the brooch had crossed a line the family could not pretend away. Rank had placed her beside the king, but rank could not rewrite Diana's place in the hearts of those who loved her. Camilla had wanted acceptance. Instead, the sapphire taught her that acceptance cannot be taken from someone else's grief. William stood nearby, silent but steadier. The prince watched Anne close the file, and this time, no one challenged her. Later, away from the room where the order had been signed, he thanked her privately. He did not give a speech. He did not search for grand words. He simply embraced her, and the gesture carried years of unsaid gratitude. Anne held him for a moment, and the princess understood that her defiance had protected more than a jewel. It had protected a son's right to remember his mother, without permission from the palace. Charles admitted to William, in a private recorded conversation preserved in the family account, that he had mistaken symbolic reconciliation for healing. The king said the mistake had placed pain on display before the whole world. William listened, and though the words did not erase the damage, they gave the moment a hard kind of honesty. Anne's action became the night's defining truth. The monarchy survives, not by burying emotion, but by honoring where emotion still matters. The banquet halt meant Diana's memory was no longer available for palace convenience. It belonged first to those who loved her, lost her, and still carried her absence. The monarchy emerged bruised, but clearer. Camilla learned that rank cannot rewrite memory. Charles learned that peace built on avoidance will always collapse under truth. William learned that he was not alone in defending his mother's dignity. And Anne proved that loyalty is not obedience sometimes. Loyalty is the courage to stop the room, name the wound, and protect what should never have been touched. This was not the end of a family. It was the moment the family finally admitted that some memories are sacred, and that even a crown must bow before them. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.